The grand mansion in Beverly Hills stood silent under the pale morning sun, its sprawling facade an emblem of wealth and power. Inside, the pristine living room had become the stage for tragedy. Crystal glass shards glittered on the floor, shattered sculptures lay in ruins, and an exquisite abstract painting hung askew, its frame cracked. At the center of it all was Jessica Ashford, the renowned biotech magnate, her lifeless body sprawled on the marble floor. Blood pooled around her head, seeping into the fine Persian rug. Detective Laura Caldwell, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp intuition, arrived on the scene. Her steel-gray eyes scanned the chaotic tableau with practiced detachment. To the untrained eye, it was a tragic accident. To her, the destruction whispered of a violent struggle. Something about the scene felt off. The room was a blend of deliberate elegance and sudden violence, a perfect metaphor for Jessica's life, Laura thought. "Who found the body?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The housekeeper, Isabel Rivera, stepped forward, clutching a handkerchief, her eyes red from crying. I came in this morning to clean," she stammered, her accent thick with emotion. "I found her like this. And Mr. Breland, he's gone." At the mention of his name, Laura's gaze sharpened. Ethan Breland, Jessica's live-in companion, had been spotted on the security footage, fleeing the mansion mere hours earlier. His shirt was bloodied, his expression panicked. The footage painted him as the obvious suspect, but Laura knew better than to jump to conclusions. Still, the image gnawed at her. What had driven this young man to such desperation? "Let's secure the area," Laura ordered, stepping gingerly over a shattered vase. Her mind raced through possibilities as she surveyed the evidence. On a nearby table, a glass of red wine sat untouched, a subtle fingerprint visible on its surface. A phone lay discarded on the couch, its screen cracked, its last notification glowing faintly, "Arya Thompson, 10:45 p.m. "Arya Thompson," Laura murmured, committing the name to memory. Whoever she was, she might hold a piece of this dark puzzle. The whispers in the neighborhood began almost immediately. Jessica Ashford, the biotech titan, was dead. Rumors swirled about her tumultuous personal life, her penchant for control, and her much younger companion, Ethan Breland. The media was quick to dub him a kept man, but Laura's gut told her this story was far more complicated. As forensic investigators swarmed the scene, Laura lingered in the room, her instincts pulling at threads invisible to others. A single question loomed in her mind: what kind of woman built a life of perfection, only for it to end in bloodshed? Far from the mansion, Ethan Breland stumbled down a quiet street, his breathing ragged, his mind racing. His arm bore the sting of a fresh wound, hastily bandaged with a torn sleeve. He couldn't think straight, couldn't process what had just happened. All he knew was that Jessica was dead, and his life, as he knew it, was over. Each step carried him further from the glittering cage that had once been his sanctuary. But no matter how far he ran, the weight of that final confrontation hung heavy, a storm gathering on the horizon. The rise of Jessica Ashford, the brilliant biotech pioneer, was as remarkable as it was ruthless. Born in the Boston suburb of Brookline, Jessica's early life was a study in contrasts, promise and pressure, brilliance and burden. She grew up in a modest home with her mother, a no-nonsense high school teacher, and her father, a kind but timid accountant. To outsiders, they were the perfect family. But within those walls, Jessica bore the weight of expectations heavier than any child should carry. Her mother, Martha, was a woman of sharp words and sharper discipline, demanding nothing short of excellence from her children. For Jessica, this translated into endless hours of study, no room for mistakes, and little patience for childish dreams. Her younger brother, Matthew, often shrank under the weight of their mother's demands, but Jessica absorbed them with a quiet resolve. Failure, in her mind, was not an option. At the age of 16, Jessica's world cracked open with a single, devastating event. Her father died in a car accident on a rainy November evening, a night Jessica would never forget. He had been on his way to pick her up from a late-night study session at the library. Jessica, distracted by her chemistry notes, had delayed him by nearly an hour. She had insisted on finishing her work, and it was this delay, she believed, that placed him on that fateful road at the worst possible moment. The crushing guilt that followed became a shadow she could never quite escape. After her father's death, Jessica's mother doubled down on her control, pushing Jessica harder. "You have to be the strong one now," Martha would say. "Your father isn't here to coddle you." Jessica did not crumble under the weight, she thrived in spite of it, though it left deep cracks in her foundation. Her natural aptitude for science became the lifeline she clung to. At 17, Jessica was admitted to MIT on a full scholarship, a testament to her brilliance. The halls of academia provided her a taste of freedom for the first time in her life, though the scars of her upbringing lingered. She buried herself in her work, determined to prove that the sacrifices she'd endured had not been in vain. By her early 20s, Jessica had already published groundbreaking research on neuroplasticity, catching the attention of leading biotech firms. It wasn't long before she co-founded her own company, Neuralink, specializing in brain-computer interface technologies. The company became her obsession, her means of control in a chaotic world. Every patent, every breakthrough, was a triumph over the doubts that had plagued her since childhood. But success, as dazzling as it was, came with a cost. Jessica's relentless drive and ruthless ambition quickly earned her both admirers and enemies. Colleagues spoke of her ability to charm and manipulate with equal ease. She had a knack for identifying weaknesses and exploiting them, whether in a boardroom negotiation or a professional rivalry. To Jessica, the world was divided into two categories, those who helped her achieve her goals and those who stood in her way. Her personal life, however, was another matter entirely. Jessica's early relationships were fleeting, passion often giving way to disillusionment. Her first husband, Eric, was a fellow researcher she met at MIT. Their shared love of science initially drew them together, but their marriage unraveled within 3 years. Eric cited Jessica's emotional unavailability and relentless focus on her work as the reasons for their split. Her second husband, Daniel, was a venture capitalist whose charm and connections helped Neuralink grow exponentially. Yet Jessica's deep-seated trust issues led her to suspect infidelity, and their marriage ended in a bitter divorce after 5 years. Her third marriage, to Robert, an art dealer 10 years her junior, was the most tumultuous of all. Jessica's controlling tendencies clashed with Robert's free-spirited nature, leading to accusations of manipulation on both sides. When they divorced, Jessica swore off traditional relationships altogether. By the time Jessica reached her late 40s, she had everything she thought she wanted: wealth, power, and recognition. But beneath the polished exterior of success lay a woman haunted by loneliness and insecurity. The cracks in her armor began to show. She avoided personal connections, fearing the vulnerability they required, and instead turned to transactional relationships. Younger men, vibrant, malleable, and uncomplicated, became her companions of choice. She found comfort in controlling the terms of these relationships, ensuring she never had to relinquish power. Yet, as she crossed into her 50s, a creeping sense of emptiness began to gnaw at her. Her once thrilling accomplishments felt hollow, her carefully curated life sterile. Despite her outward confidence, Jessica was deeply aware of the ticking clock, time that no amount of money or power could slow. For all her triumphs, she had no one to share them with, and that realization stung more than she could admit. It was this vulnerability, buried beneath layers of composure and control, that made her susceptible to Ethan Breland's quiet charm. When Jessica met him in the bustling cafe in downtown Los Angeles, she saw in him something she had long since lost: raw potential, untainted by the cynicism of the world she inhabited. He was a blank canvas, someone she could mold into her ideal partner, a companion who wouldn't challenge her authority or question her flaws. But Jessica's need for control, born of years of striving to stay ahead, would ultimately prove to be her downfall. The seeds of her tragic end were planted long before she met Ethan, buried deep in the traumas and triumphs of her past. Ethan Breland was born into a world that offered little in the way of opportunity. The youngest of 4 siblings, he grew up in a modest house in rural Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. His father, a long-haul truck driver with a penchant for disappearing for weeks at a time, abandoned the family when Ethan was just 5. His mother, already worn thin by poverty and depression, struggled to keep the family afloat. For Ethan, childhood was less about innocence and more about survival. Despite the hardships, Ethan possessed an innate charm and good looks that set him apart. In school, he quickly learned that a quick smile and a well-timed compliment could get him out of trouble or even win him small favors. Teachers described him as full of potential but unmotivated, a sentiment that would follow him into adulthood. His older siblings, burdened by their own struggles, left home one by one, leaving Ethan to navigate the chaos alone. Basketball became Ethan's saving grace. Tall, agile, and naturally athletic, he excelled on the court, earning the admiration of teammates and the attention of scouts. By his senior year of high school, Ethan had secured a partial athletic scholarship to a small liberal arts college in Philadelphia. It was his chance to escape the cycle of poverty that had plagued his family, and for a brief moment, his future seemed bright. But college life proved to be both a blessing and a curse. Away from the watchful eyes of his high school coaches and teachers, Ethan found himself drawn to the freedom and temptations of campus life. Late-night parties, a steady stream of new friends, and the allure of easy distractions quickly consumed him. His grades plummeted, and his spot on the basketball team slipped through his fingers. By the end of his freshman year, Ethan lost his scholarship and, with it, his ticket to a better life. Too ashamed to return home, Ethan chose to remain in Philadelphia. He drifted between low-wage jobs, often crashing on the couches of friends who were more forgiving than responsible. For a while, he worked at a bar where his natural charisma earned him generous tips, but he eventually lost the job after a fight broke out with a particularly drunk patron. Then came the car accident. It was a rainy night in late 2020. Ethan, out with a group of friends, had been drinking at a house party when someone handed him a set of car keys. Against his better judgment, he climbed behind the wheel. Moments later, a sharp turn on a slick road led to disaster. The car skidded out of control, slamming into a parked vehicle and injuring a pedestrian who had been walking nearby. Panicked and disoriented, Ethan fled the scene before the authorities arrived. The incident left a permanent mark on Ethan's psyche. Though the pedestrian survived, the guilt gnawed at him. The case went cold due to lack of evidence, but Ethan couldn't shake the fear that one day it would resurface. The accident marked the beginning of a downward spiral. He convinced himself that he wasn't destined for more than the life he was currently living, rootless, aimless, and filled with regret. In early 2023, desperate for a fresh start, Ethan moved to Los Angeles. He had no plan, no real prospects, but the city's promise of reinvention appealed to him. He found work as a barista at an upscale cafe, catering to the city's wealthiest and most influential. The job was unremarkable, but it paid the bills and offered a glimpse into a world Ethan could only dream of. It was there, on a rainy Tuesday morning, that he met Jessica Ashford. She walked into the cafe with the quiet confidence of someone who had the world at her feet. Ethan noticed her immediately, poised, elegant, and entirely out of his league. Jessica, in turn, was struck by Ethan's brooding demeanor and easy charm. He was a stark contrast to the polished executives she usually encountered. Their first conversation was brief, little more than polite pleasantries exchanged over a cappuccino, but it left an impression on both of them. Over the following weeks, Jessica began to frequent the cafe more often, always ensuring she was served by Ethan. She would linger at the counter, asking him questions about his life, drawing out fragments of his story. Ethan, at first guarded, eventually opened up to her in ways he hadn't with anyone in years. Jessica saw something in Ethan, raw potential, untapped and unpolished. She saw a young man whose life had been marked by misfortune but who still had an ember of hope burning within him. To Ethan, Jessica represented everything he thought he wanted: sophistication, stability, and an escape from the mediocrity of his current existence. One evening, as the cafe began to close, Jessica made her move. She invited Ethan to an art gallery opening, her tone making it clear that this was more than a casual invitation. Ethan, hesitant but intrigued, agreed. The gallery, with its glittering chandeliers and whispered conversations, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Jessica guided him through the evening, introducing him to her circle of elite acquaintances as her guest. By the end of the night, Ethan felt intoxicated, not by the wine, but by the glimpse into a life he had never imagined for himself. Jessica, sensing his awe, laid out her proposition. She offered him a chance to reinvent himself, financial support, introductions to her world of luxury, and a place to live. In exchange, she expected his companionship, discretion, and loyalty. It was an arrangement Ethan knew he should refuse, but he didn't. The promise of escape, of stepping into a life so far removed from his painful past, was too enticing to resist. What he couldn't know was that this gilded cage would soon become a prison, and the woman who seemed to offer salvation would prove to be his greatest torment. Arya Thompson was the kind of woman who radiated energy wherever she went. At just 20, she was already carving her path as a passionate art history student at UCLA, working part-time as a docent at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA. With her vibrant red scarf and ever-present sketchbook, Arya was a sharp contrast to the polished, controlled world of Jessica Ashford. It was at the LACMA that Ethan Breland first encountered Arya. Jessica had insisted Ethan take up art appreciation as part of his education. At first, he found the museum visits tedious, another way Jessica exerted control over him. But on a breezy autumn afternoon, Ethan noticed Arya leading a small tour group, her voice animated as she described the emotional undertones of a 19th-century landscape painting. Her genuine enthusiasm was magnetic, a refreshing counterpoint to the sterile opulence that had come to define his life with Jessica. After the tour, Ethan hesitated but eventually approached her, pretending to have questions about the exhibition. Arya's easy laugh and approachable demeanor instantly put him at ease. Their conversation flowed naturally, ranging from art to philosophy to the best late-night diners in the city. For the first time in months, Ethan felt seen, not as Jessica's project or her companion, but as himself. Arya's interest in him seemed untainted by ulterior motives, and her world, though modest, felt real and vibrant. Over the next few weeks, Ethan found himself returning to the museum more often, carefully timing his visits to coincide with Arya's shifts. Their friendship blossomed quickly, built on shared interests and a mutual sense of curiosity. Arya introduced Ethan to her circle of friends, fellow students, artists, and musicians. They spent evenings at indie film screenings, rooftop gatherings, and 24-hour diners, engaging in debates that stretched into the early hours of the morning. Arya's world was intoxicating to Ethan. It reminded him of the life he might have had if he hadn't lost his scholarship, if he hadn't made the decisions that had led him to Jessica. Arya encouraged him to explore his artistic side, even gifting him a vintage camera she'd found at a flea market. For Ethan, her kindness was a stark contrast to Jessica's transactional love. Arya made him feel human again. But as his connection with Arya deepened, Ethan's absences from Jessica's estate became more frequent. Jessica, ever perceptive, began to notice the shift. She asked questions, at first subtle, then pointed. Ethan deflected as best he could, but Jessica's instincts, honed through years of corporate maneuvering, were razor-sharp. She sensed a threat but couldn't yet put a name to it. The pieces fell into place one evening when Jessica received an update from the private investigator she had hired to monitor Ethan's movements. The report included photographs of Ethan and Arya laughing together at a cafe near the museum, their body language betraying a connection far deeper than mere friendship. Jessica's gaze hardened as she scanned the images, her lips pressing into a thin line. But it wasn't just Arya's presence that set her on edge, it was her name. Jessica knew the name Thompson all too well. Decades earlier, her estranged brother, Matthew Ashford, had married a woman named Claire Thompson. The investigators' additional details confirmed her growing suspicion: Arya was Matthew's daughter, her niece. The revelation hit Jessica like a physical blow. For years, she had buried the guilt of her broken relationship with Matthew. Their falling out had been bitter. Jessica had chosen her career over family, prioritizing her company over her brother's struggles. Matthew, disillusioned and angry, had moved to San Diego, taking his wife and newborn daughter with him. They had not spoken since. Now, Jessica's niece had unknowingly entered her life, threatening to unravel the carefully curated world Jessica had built. It wasn't just Ethan's growing attachment to Arya that troubled Jessica, it was the specter of her own past, clawing its way back into the present. Arya represented everything Jessica had tried to forget: family, vulnerability, and the choices that had cost her so much. At first, Jessica debated whether to confront Arya directly. But her fear of losing control over Ethan clouded her judgment. Instead, she doubled down on her manipulation, determined to sever Ethan's ties to Arya before they could deepen further. She increased her demands on Ethan, scheduling impromptu dinners and surprise weekend trips that conveniently coincided with Arya's events. When Ethan hesitated, Jessica feigned illness, migraines, fainting spells, forcing him to stay by her side out of guilt. Arya, meanwhile, grew increasingly confused by Ethan's erratic behavior. He began missing their planned meetups, his texts became curt and infrequent, and the lightheartedness she had come to cherish in him started to fade. When she pressed him for answers, Ethan evaded, unwilling to share the full extent of Jessica's control over him. The tension reached its breaking point one evening when Jessica, under the pretense of a security upgrade, accessed Ethan's phone and found a text thread with Arya. Reading their conversations, Jessica felt a white-hot surge of anger. Arya wasn't just a threat to her relationship with Ethan, she was a personal affront, a reminder of the family ties Jessica had severed long ago. Fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy and unresolved guilt, Jessica resolved to take drastic action. What began as a transactional arrangement with Ethan was now spiraling into something far darker. Jessica was no longer just trying to hold on to a companion, she was fighting to maintain control over her carefully constructed life. And Arya, though unaware of the full extent of Jessica's past, had unknowingly become the catalyst for Jessica's unraveling. The stage was set for confrontation, and the choices made in the coming weeks would shatter all three lives. Jessica's obsession, Ethan's desperation, and Arya's innocence were now locked on a collision course that could only end in tragedy. The dynamic between Jessica Ashford and Ethan Breland had always been imbalanced, but now, it teetered on the brink of collapse. What once seemed like a carefully negotiated arrangement, financial stability in exchange for companionship, had devolved into a web of manipulation, fear, and control. Jessica's growing obsession with Ethan was no longer just about keeping him by her side, it was about maintaining the illusion that she could control everything and everyone in her life. Jessica's discovery of Arya Thompson's identity had struck a nerve she hadn't touched in years. Arya wasn't just a young woman threatening to take Ethan away, she was the living embodiment of the family Jessica had left behind. The very thought of her niece unwittingly dismantling the life Jessica had built was intolerable. Fueled by this toxic blend of jealousy and guilt, Jessica began to deploy every weapon in her arsenal to isolate Ethan from Arya. At first, her tactics were subtle. Jessica suggested weekend getaways to Napa Valley or impromptu dinners at exclusive restaurants, always coinciding with the times Ethan had planned to meet Arya. When Ethan hesitated, she turned to guilt. "You've been spending so much time away lately," she'd say, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "I thought we were building something together." Am I asking for too much? When that failed, Jessica escalated. She feigned fainting spells and migraines, leaving Ethan no choice but to cancel his plans. Her performance was so convincing that Ethan began to doubt himself. He worried she might truly be ill, and guilt gnawed at him every time he thought about leaving her. Meanwhile, Jessica's obsession started to seep into other areas of her life. At work, her once impeccable focus began to waver. She became irritable during meetings, snapping at colleagues for minor mistakes. Her assistant noticed empty wine bottles piling up in the office trash, a stark contrast to Jessica's typically disciplined demeanor. At home, Jessica's behavior swung wildly between affectionate and erratic. One evening, she presented Ethan with an expensive watch, whispering, "You're the only one who's ever understood me." The next, she unleashed a torrent of passive-aggressive comments about his ungratefulness and secrecy. Ethan, feeling increasingly trapped, began to pull away emotionally. He avoided conversations about his whereabouts, became more guarded with his phone, and stopped sharing details about his day. But Jessica's sharp instincts picked up on every small shift. The more Ethan withdrew, the tighter Jessica's grip became. Her next move was financial control. Jessica had always been generous with Ethan, funding his art classes, paying for his personal trainer, and providing him with a luxurious guest house on her estate. But now, she began withholding his monthly allowance, claiming vague business issues or delays with her accounts. When Ethan confronted her, Jessica relented, but not before extracting promises of more time spent together and a renewed commitment to their relationship. Jessica also started planting seeds of doubt in Ethan's mind about Arya. "Are you sure she's genuine?" she asked one evening, her tone casual but cutting. "Young women like her, they're drawn to people with means. Be careful she's not just using you." At the same time, Jessica used her connections to interfere with Arya's life. Through a subtle but effective campaign, she ensured that Arya's museum hours were cut, citing budgetary constraints. She even attempted to sabotage Arya's chances at an academic grant, leveraging her influence with one of the benefactors. Arya, confused by the sudden setbacks, had no idea Jessica was pulling the strings. For Ethan, the situation became unbearable. Jessica's control over his life felt suffocating, and the constant guilt she wielded like a weapon left him emotionally drained. The vibrant, confident young man Arya had met was now a shadow of himself. His once passionate creative pursuits, the photography Arya had inspired, faded as his energy was consumed by Jessica's demands. But Jessica underestimated Ethan's growing desperation. One evening, he made a bold decision to confide in Arya. They met at a quiet diner far from the museum, where Ethan, after much hesitation, told her about the controlling nature of his relationship with Jessica. He avoided mentioning the financial arrangement but admitted, "I feel like I'm drowning. She has so much power over me. I don't know how to get out." Arya, horrified but determined, urged Ethan to leave Jessica. "You deserve better than this," she said firmly. "You're not her property." Ethan wanted to believe her, but Jessica's influence loomed large in his mind. She had a way of pulling him back, using the promise of comfort or the threat of exposure to keep him in line. Worse, Ethan knew Jessica was aware of his past, the car accident that had haunted him for years. If she chose to expose him, his life could unravel completely. Jessica, meanwhile, sensed Ethan's growing resolve. Her paranoia intensified, driving her to take even more drastic measures. She began monitoring Ethan's phone under the guise of security upgrades. When she found messages between him and Arya, her fears were confirmed. Her anger turned to obsession, and she resolved to eliminate Arya from Ethan's life once and for all. Jessica's once controlled world was spiraling. She was no longer the composed, powerful woman at the top of her game, she was a woman clinging to the shreds of her control. The more she tightened her grasp, the more Ethan slipped through her fingers. The stage was set for a confrontation, and Jessica's escalating tactics were pushing both herself and Ethan toward a breaking point. Neither of them could see it yet, but the lines between love, control, and destruction had already blurred. The inevitable collision was coming, and it would leave no one unscathed. The air in Jessica Ashford's mansion was electric with tension. It was an icy January evening, and the sprawling estate in Beverly Hills seemed unusually quiet. Inside, however, emotions simmered dangerously close to the surface. The carefully curated facade of Jessica's life, her wealth, her power, her control, was cracking. She could feel it slipping away, piece by agonizing piece. Earlier that day, Jessica had insisted Ethan accompany her to an exclusive art gala. He had hesitated, offering a weak excuse about not feeling well, but Jessica wasn't taking no for an answer. "You've been distant," she said, her tone sweet but laced with steel. "Tonight is important to me. I need you there." Ethan relented, but the tension between them was palpable from the moment they arrived. Jessica paraded Ethan through the room, introducing him to influential guests as her partner, her possessive grip on his arm making her intentions clear. But her calculated display of dominance unraveled and Ethan's eyes locked with a familiar face across the room, Arya Thompson. Arya was radiant in a vintage dress, her presence a stark contrast to the cold sophistication of the gala. For a moment, the world around Ethan seemed to fade. Arya's warmth, her freedom, and the promise of a life unshackled from Jessica's control beckoned to him. Jessica noticed the flicker of recognition in Ethan's eyes and followed his gaze. The sight of Arya sent a surge of fury through her. She tightened her grip on Ethan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't even think about it," she hissed. But Ethan had reached his breaking point. He mumbled a strained excuse, slipped from Jessica's grasp, and fled the gallery. Arya watched him go, concern etched on her face. Jessica stood frozen, her carefully constructed world teetering on the brink of collapse. When Ethan returned to the mansion hours later, Jessica was waiting for him. She sat in the living room, her posture unnervingly calm, a glass of wine in hand. The room was dimly lit, the shadows accentuating the sharp angles of her face. Ethan hesitated in the doorway, sensing the storm brewing beneath her composed exterior. "Do you think I'm a fool, Ethan?" Jessica's voice was quiet, but the undercurrent of anger was unmistakable. "Do you think I don't know what you've been doing? Where you've been going?" Ethan stepped further into the room, his jaw tightening. "I'm not doing this right now, Jessica," he said, his voice weary but firm. "I'm done." Jessica's calm facade shattered. She slammed the glass onto the coffee table, shattering it into jagged pieces. "You're done," she spat, rising to her feet. "After everything I've done for you? After everything I've given you?" Ethan met her gaze, his own anger rising to match hers. "You haven't given me anything, Jessica. You've controlled me. Manipulated me. I can't live like this anymore." Jessica's laugh was cold and hollow. "Controlled you? You'd be nothing without me. A nobody working dead-end jobs, drowning in your own failures. I made you who you are, Ethan. You owe me." The words hung heavy in the air, but Ethan didn't flinch. "I don't owe you anything," he said quietly. "I'm leaving." Jessica's eyes narrowed, her fury giving way to something darker, calculated malice. "Oh, you think you can just walk away?" she sneered. "Do you remember the car accident, Ethan? Because I do. I know everything. I have the police reports, the witness statements. If you leave me, I will destroy you." Ethan froze. The weight of Jessica's words was suffocating. She had always hinted at her knowledge of his past, but hearing her lay it out so coldly was like a punch to the gut. His hands clenched into fists, his mind racing. For a moment, he felt paralyzed, trapped once again in Jessica's web. But then something shifted. The fear that had gripped him for so long was replaced by anger, anger at her manipulation, her threats, her relentless need to control him. "Go ahead," he said, his voice steady but trembling with emotion. "Expose me. Do whatever you have to do. I'd rather face the consequences than spend another second under your thumb." Jessica's composure disintegrated. Her face twisted with rage as she lunged at Ethan, her manicured nails raking across his face. Ethan stumbled backward, his arm knocking over a vase that shattered against the marble floor. The sound seemed to escalate her fury. Jessica grabbed a heavy crystal decanter from the bar and swung it at Ethan's head. He ducked just in time, the decanter smashing against the wall. "Stop this, Jessica!" Ethan shouted, grabbing her wrists to restrain her. "You're out of control." But Jessica was beyond reason. She fought against him, screaming incoherently about betrayal and ingratitude. In the chaos, they stumbled into the corner of the room, where Jessica's desk stood. Her hand closed around a letter opener, a sharp, ornate piece of metal, and she swung it wildly. Ethan managed to deflect the blow, but the blade sliced into his arm, sending a spray of blood across the room. The sight of blood seemed to snap something in Jessica. She staggered backward, the letter opener slipping from her fingers. For a moment, the room was still, the only sound the ragged breaths of both combatants. But as Ethan stepped toward the door, Jessica made one last desperate attempt to stop him. She grabbed his injured arm and yanked, trying to pull him back. Acting on pure instinct, Ethan shoved her away. Jessica stumbled, her heel catching on the edge of a rug. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her head striking the corner of the marble fireplace with a sickening crack. She crumpled to the floor, motionless. Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room, once a battleground of chaos, was now eerily silent. Blood pooled beneath Jessica's head, the life draining from her once commanding presence. With trembling hands, Ethan checked for a pulse. There was none. Realizing the gravity of what had occurred, Ethan stumbled out of the mansion into the cold night air. His heart pounded in his chest as he fled the scene, leaving behind the shattered remnants of Jessica's world, and his own. The morning sun cast an unforgiving light on the scene inside Jessica Ashford's mansion. Broken glass, bloodstains, and overturned furniture painted a vivid picture of the chaos that had unfolded the night before. The tranquility of Beverly Hills was shattered when Isabel Rivera, Jessica's housekeeper, discovered her employer's lifeless body and called 911. Her panicked screams brought neighbors running, and soon the estate was swarmed with detectives, forensic teams, and news crews eager to uncover the truth behind the shocking death of one of the city's most powerful women. Detective Laura Caldwell arrived within the hour, her seasoned gaze taking in the tableau of violence. Jessica's body lay crumpled by the fireplace, a pool of blood beneath her head. The blood spatter, the shattered artifacts, the defensive wounds on her hands, all of it told a story of a struggle that had spiraled out of control. Surveillance footage revealed Ethan Breland fleeing the scene in the early hours of the morning, his shirt stained with blood. It didn't take long for him to become the prime suspect. An all-points bulletin was issued, and the media spun the narrative of a kept man who had turned on his benefactor. Headlines screamed of betrayal, greed, and violence. But as Detective Caldwell delved deeper into the case, a more complex picture began to emerge. Interviews with staff and acquaintances painted Jessica as a brilliant but deeply troubled woman. Her obsession with control, her volatile moods, and her manipulative tendencies were well known to those close to her. Arya Thompson, racked with guilt over her unintentional role in the events, came forward with evidence that shifted the narrative. She provided text messages and voicemails from Ethan, revealing Jessica's escalating behavior and the psychological toll it had taken on him. "I knew something was wrong," Arya admitted during her interview. "He was so scared, but he didn't know how to get out." The forensic evidence corroborated Ethan's account of the fatal confrontation. Blood patterns and injuries on both Jessica and Ethan suggested a struggle where Jessica had been the aggressor. Most damning of all was Jessica's own digital footprint. A thorough investigation of her devices uncovered evidence of her tracking Ethan's movements, recording their private conversations, and interfering in Arya's life. The extent of Jessica's obsession shocked even the most seasoned investigators. When Ethan was finally located days later, hiding in a motel outside of Santa Monica, he was arrested without incident. During his trial, the defense presented a compelling case. Ethan was a young man trapped in an abusive and controlling relationship, pushed to his breaking point. They argued that Jessica's death, while tragic, was the unintended consequence of a desperate attempt to escape her manipulation. The prosecution countered with claims of premeditation, highlighting Ethan's decision to flee the scene. The jury was left to grapple with a difficult question: was Ethan a cold-blooded killer or a victim of circumstance? After weeks of emotional testimony and 3 days of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict: involuntary manslaughter. The judge, taking into account Ethan's lack of prior criminal record and the overwhelming evidence of Jessica's manipulative behavior, sentenced him to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3. It was a polarizing decision. Some felt it was too lenient, while others argued that Ethan had already endured enough. Jessica's death left a void in the lives of those who had admired her brilliance, but it also exposed the dangerous consequences of unchecked obsession and power. Ethan's story became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of how control masquerading as love can destroy lives. Arya, devastated but determined, channeled her grief into her art, creating a series of pieces that explored themes of freedom, entrapment, and redemption. Ethan, now serving his sentence, found a measure of peace in the knowledge that the truth had been revealed. Though he would forever carry the scars of that fateful night, he vowed to rebuild his life, one step at a time. What drives someone like Jessica Ashford to such extremes? Could Ethan have escaped before it all spiraled out of control? And most importantly, how often do we fail to recognize the subtle signs of a relationship built on manipulation and power imbalance? What do you think? What are your thoughts on Jessica and Ethan's tragic story? Was justice served, or should the outcome have been different? Do you believe relationships like theirs are more common than we think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective on this gripping case. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime tales that dig deep into the human psyche.